Well, hopefully you found that interesting, and that you played along and saw how you performed compared to what the narrator was saying you should do. If you varied, if you didn't do like he said your sex should do, it's a good example of how within each sex there's a lot of variability. So on average, males may be better at this part and females might be better at that part of memory, but all of us within the sexes can vary. And so it's really important to always just say to yourself, okay, these are averages, that you can be atypical for your group and still that doesn't mean that the entire theory is incorrect. So we're going to start diving into why there might be differences, like what factors go into determining the differences that we do see between males and females. So, some of you already know this, but, just to reiterate, as you're aware, moms carry two X's and dads carry an X and a Y. So when sperm are created, half of them have X's and half of them have Y's. When the eggs were created or the ova were created, they all contain X's. So whenever a baby is created, mom always donates an X, and dad half the time donates an X, half the time he donates a Y. Whenever he donates an X, that creates a female offspring. Whenever he whenever he donates a Y, that creates a male offspring. So hopefully you already knew that, but so having an XX chromosomal pattern means that offspring will have ovaries. For those gonads that offspring carries during the course of gestation will convert from gonads into ovaries. And ultimately, those ovaries are going to produce the hormone estradiol. We usually call it estrogen for short. If there's a Y chromosome present, then those gonads are going to convert into testes. And testes produce the androgens, testosterone being one of the androgens. Now, this is typical development. Sometimes the gonads don't convert at all, and they stay gonads, and they don't produce any kind of hormones. It's never the case that an XY carrying individual would ever produce ovaries. That doesn't happen. If the person has an XY chromosome pattern and something goes wrong in the transition from gonad to basically sex organ, the way that manifests itself is that the gonad just doesn't differentiate. There's no such thing as a gonad that would be consistent with the other sex. That's not how they work. I've heard people on the internet, and I've heard people live make claims that are contrary to that. I heard a speaker claim that a biological male has been documented to have given birth because that biological male actually had apparently ovaries and internal organs. It's impossible. I think the thing that the person might have gotten the impression from was a case where a woman had a condition called chimerism, and in her body, some of her cells were XX and some of her cells were XY. The important thing for her, though, is that all of her reproductive organs contain cells that were XX. So she had ovaries and a uterus and a vagina and all the normal things that would come from having an XX pattern. She had XY chromosomes in other cells of her body that were independent and unrelated to reproduction. The only way they found out that she had that condition is that when her daughter, who appeared completely female, discovered she was infertile, and she went through all these tests and discovered that her sex organs were XY. And so as a chimera also, she had XX cells throughout many parts of her body. So she had breasts and other things that appeared to have secondary sex characteristics, but her internal organs were XY. Okay, that's a really, really, really unusual condition, like very uncommon. And this was not in the case of the mom who, actually had the was able to have a baby, she was not a male who had a baby. She was a woman who had some XY cells in her body, and not in her reproductive organs. So it's really super important to not get a lot of information off of places like TikTok or from people who don't really know what they're talking about. They use their logic and not the truth. I looked up the original medical report on this case. I asked the person who was speaking, I've never heard of such a thing. Can you give me a reference so I can look it up? And that person had no, they said, I'll get back to you, and never provided anything, even though I did many follow-ups and asked. I really would like to read where you got that. And they had no references for it. And the closest I could come to was this chimeric mom. Typically, if all the cells in your body contain XX, then the typical pattern is for those gonads to turn into ovaries that then will start to produce estradiol. If something goes wrong in the development of an XX carrying offspring, again, the gonads would stay gonads and the hormones would not be produced. They think that this kind of, that's called a person who's intersexed, where they've got sex chromosomes in their 23rd position, but they're not producing, they don't have ovaries or testes, they have gonads. The estimate is that it happens about one time in 3,000 conceptions, or in 3,000 offspring. It's a very, very, very rare condition, but it does happen. So there's also situations where a person who has an XY pattern produces testicles, but then those testicles either don't produce androgens or their body is insensitive to those androgens. And so that can have an impact on how their external genitals appear. Females can have a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia that can cause testosterone to be flooded through their bodies. And so they can, so their hormones can look more like a male pattern. And so there are things that can happen that can cause a person's external genitalia to look male or female or something in between and sort of indistinct. But again, those are really, really super rare conditions. These are like 1 in 1,000 to maybe 1 in 10,000, depending on which study you look at. And so very uncommon conditions. The typical pattern is XX carrying offspring have ovaries and produce estrogens. XY carrying offspring have testes and produce the androgens. Now, it's important to know sort of this stuff because the hormones that are produced have an impact on the developing brain in the womb. They have an impact on the form of the body that is developing in the womb, and then have an impact on the types of hormones that will be produced later at puberty that then will further impact the developing brain and body of the person who's going through puberty. So these are really important things to understand and know. So that's why I thought it was worth talking about that a little bit. So hormones during and after puberty. So if you look at a female, here we have the menstrual cycle, and day 1 of the menstrual cycle would be the first day that there is any blood that is being shed. So day 1, and the average menstrual cycle lasts 28 days. So that's what you're seeing on the y-axis. And then you look at the level of estradiol in the blood. You see that over the menstrual cycle, females tend to experience, peaks and valleys, hills of estrogen levels. So it varies across the month. It's not something that females are consistently experiencing high levels of estrogen. It tends to peak around ovulation, which is about day 14 of the menstrual cycle, goes down a little bit, and then it comes back up in the days leading up to the next menses. So major differences in the amount of hormones produced during and after puberty throughout the menstrual cycle for females. So we call females, typically we say that they have cyclical hormonal fluctuations. Typically the cycle is 28 days on average, but women have different lengths of menstrual cycles that are normal for them. And what we see in conjunction with their individual cycle is that they may experience certain kinds of mood changes, especially in that estrogen peak that leads up to the next onset of menses. They may be more irritable. They might be more likely to tear up or to get angry. Because of this cyclical nature of female menstrual cycles, this has been used as a reason to keep women out of certain careers, to keep women out of certain social settings. There are places around the world today where women are still barred from certain things because of the existence of cyclical hormonal fluctuations. It took a long time for women to get the right to be pilots because there was this belief that a woman pilot during one of her cycles might just go nuts, fly the plane into a mountain, right? Interestingly, the times that has actually happened, it's been a male pilot. And the bad part about, males not having a cyclical nature to their hormone profiles is that you don't know when they might be hormonally induced to fly into a mountain, whereas at least females kind of know. But it's been used, the cyclical nature has been used for generations, for thousands of years, to keep women out of politics, keep women out of positions of power or decision making, because you never know when her decisions are going to be sound. Well, kind of you do. If you're going to blame the cyclical nature, you're going to be able to say, well, at certain points in the cycle we can't trust her judgments. However, I'd like to argue that you can trust female judgments at any point in their cycle, just like you can a male's judgment at any point in his hormonal patterns. Anyway, having a non-cyclical pattern, by the way, for males doesn't mean that they don't experience peaks and valleys of testosterone or other androgens. There is a large cycle that males tend to operate on where their testosterone levels are on average higher during the fall, which corresponds to a lot of other animals that go into rut in the fall. Males tend to experience a similar boost of testosterone in the fall, like other animals that compete for access to females and stuff like that. And then also males tend to experience a daily peak of testosterone, typically in the morning. There's sometimes some outward evidence, so to speak, of that peak of testosterone that males might be experiencing. But so males do have a cycle. They actually have two cycles, a cycle within a cycle, whereas females tend to have the one cycle that's roughly a month long. All right, well, this is a good time to take a little break, and I'm just going to foreshadow that there are going to be smaller lectures going forward as I have videos to interrupt. And so we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about the psychoanalytic approach to sex differences.